Hey guys, it's Hannah, and today I'm going to be talking about all of my all-time favorite standalone novels. So as you may know, I'm a huge fan of series. I love book series. I read so many of them. So many of my favorite books of all time are from book series, but I also really love standalones. And in the big debate between series or standalone, I honestly can't pick one because I love both of them equally. But I really like doing like favorite series list types of videos, even though they're always kind of nerve-wracking to make because I know that I'm always going to read more standalones that I'm going to want to add to this list eventually, but at this point in time I have quite a few favorites and I thought that I would share all of them with you all in one video. Many of these standalones you've probably heard me talk about before because I mention them over and over and over again. Some of them I've mentioned less frequently on my channel, but for the most part I feel like you'll be able to guess the majority of them. This list is going to be somewhat in order. I'm gonna go from like my least favorite to most favorite. Obviously they're all favorites, but I'm saving like the first top 3 or maybe top 5 as my top 5 favorite ones. The rest are kind of just all in there together because I can't really order them, but the top 5 are essentially my top 5 favorites. But without any further ado, let's get into my all-time favorite standalone novels. The first book I have right here is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is an adult fiction novel that's kind of sci-fi, kind of post-apocalyptic. I really never know how to explain this book properly. But essentially in this story, there's a flu that has wiped out the majority of humankind and there are very few people left living. And the story takes place in 2 timelines. It takes place in a timeline prior to this flu, and it also takes place in a timeline 20 years after this flu has hit, and in that timeline we follow around this theater troupe that goes around to different settlements that are still established and performs Shakespeare. That's all I really like to say about this book, aside from the fact that it's also told from multiple different perspectives. Like, you have a lot of characters that are in this book, so sometimes it can get confusing because of that, as well as the time jumps, but each story is kind of interwoven with the other stories and everything is connected, and that's kind of like the message of the story overall in general. It's about humanity, about life, about our relationships with one another and with ourselves, and it's just such a beautiful story that I think is very highly underrated and deserves more love. I've said this many times before, but it's the type of book that really makes you think when you read it, which is something that I adore, so that's why this is one of my favorites and why I want more people to read it. The next book I have on my list of favorites is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This is a very popular book and I've talked about it countless times now, so many of you probably already know what it's about, but if you don't, it's essentially a companion to Rainbow Rowell's Fangirl, and you don't have to read one to read the other, but this story is essentially Rainbow Rowell's version of the fanfiction that Kath writes about in Fangirl, and it follows the story of Simon Snow, who is the worst chosen one in the history of chosen ones, and he attends this magical wizarding school where he has to fight this ultimate kind of evil called the Insidious Humdrum. It's basically a satire of the chosen one trope, and it's very much based off of Harry Potter, and it has wonderful characters, a fantastic romance, beautiful fan art. As you can see, Simon and Baz are my favorites. I love them so much. And it's just incredibly funny, which is one of the reasons why it's on my list. I like a very specific type of humor in books, and this book just did it perfectly. It was the right amount of humor, the right amount of drama. Like, I would cry and laugh every other page, and it was just so perfect for me to read. And I just adore the story so much. It's such a fun time, and it's so different from a lot of other YA that I've read too, especially in terms of standalones. And it's a standalone fantasy, which you don't get a lot. But those are all the reasons that I love this book so much and why it's on my list. The next book I have here is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is a historical fiction novel that follows the perspective of 2 different characters. It's set during World War II, during the occupation of France by Germany, and we follow around 2 different characters. One of them is a young blind French girl and the other one is a German boy turned Nazi soldier, and we get to see both of their perspectives and we get to see both of their stories, and then eventually those 2 stories converge, and it's just such a beautiful book. Similarly to Station 11, it's another book that really makes you think. It's the type of book that will make you question a lot of what you already believe and challenge a lot of your own ideas, and I'm always supportive of any type of book that can make me do that and also make me cry my eyes out. I really love historical fiction, and this is definitely one of my favorite ones that I've ever read, so I would highly recommend it if you're looking for some more historical fiction. And even if you're not too into historical fiction, the writing in this one is just exquisite, so I would just recommend picking it up based off of that too. The next book on my list is another historical fiction novel, but this one is YA historical fiction, and that is The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. This book, like I mentioned, is a historical fiction novel that follows the story of this boy named Monty, and it's set in England in 1700 something, which is literally what the book says inside. It's just 1700 dash line, so we don't technically know the time. But basically it follows Monty, who is this privileged boy who is set to inherit his family estate, and he has a younger sister and his best friend Percy, and he Monty, his entire life, has been in love with his best friend Percy, and he doesn't know what to do about it. Monty is very confident and pretty egotistical at times and extremely dramatic. Monty's bisexual and he's been in plenty of relationships in his life, but none of them have ever meant anything to him as much as how he feels about his best friend Percy, but he's never told Percy any of this. So that becomes kind of a challenge when the two of them, along with his sister, end up going on this road trip throughout the entirety of Europe, essentially. But it's a fantastic book. Again, like Carry On, it's hysterical. Like, I laughed so much in this book. I don't think I've ever laughed as much in any single book in my entire life like I have in this one, because this one is just so funny. But at the same time, it's also heartbreaking. Like, I cried several times throughout this book as well, and I just experienced so many emotions, and it was such a fun time. Technically, this one may not be a standalone because I've heard there's another book coming out, but I don't know if it's just like a companion novel to it or if it's like a continuation of this book, because this book does have like an ending. So I don't know, but nonetheless, I'm still including it on this list because I love this book so much. That's actually true for a couple of the other books on this list as well, who I know are getting like sequels and companion novels, but it's fine because I love them, so they have to be on this list. The other thing I really love about this book is that it deals with a lot of really complex themes as well throughout history. So we have Monty, who's bisexual, and he's trying to navigate that, as well as Percy, who is Black, and we get to see like the way race relations were kind of working throughout that time as well, and the way people treat Percy differently than they treat Monty. So I will say that there are some themes in here like homophobia and racism, so I would just say be aware of those things before going into this book, just so they don't take you off guard. But the story obviously does challenge those ideas, so it's a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for a very good laugh and a very good cry. The next book on my list is The Inexplicable Logic of My Life by Benjamin Alire-Sands. Sands is one of my favorite authors of all time. He writes some of my favorite contemporaries of all time. He's just so fantastic when it comes to telling stories about friendship, family, love, anything like that. I will read everything that he writes. So of course, this book has to be on my list of favorites because it is one of my favorite contemporary standalones that I've ever read. This one follows the story of this boy named Sal and his best friend Sam, who are just trying to get through their senior year of high school. Sal was adopted by his father into a Mexican-American family, and we get to see a lot of different kind of dynamics going on throughout the story. We have Sal kind of trying to figure out his own identity within the identity that he's been adopted into, as well as him trying to come to a better understanding of sexuality. His father is gay and one of his best friends are gay, and that kind of makes him question a lot about his own sexuality, even though he identifies as straight. And you also have him trying to grapple with trying to find out more about his birth parents and if he wants to know more about his birth parents or not. And it's just such a fantastic story. Like, I again cried so many times throughout this book. I absolutely adored it. If you want to hear more of my spoiler-free thoughts, I have a full non-spoiler review for this book, so I'll go and leave it linked on the screen as well as down below, so you can go and check it out if you're interested to hear more. So I won't say too much more about it now, aside from the fact that clearly I adore this book so much, and I just want everyone to read it because it is so incredible. The next book on my list is Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia. This book follows the story of this girl named Eliza who is famous on the internet for this webcomic that she's created called Monstrous Sea. Her webcomic is so popular that it gets millions of views, and she even has people writing fanfiction about her webcomic. And then one day this boy moves to her school who she ends up finding out is the most popular fanfiction writer of her webcomic. So she knows who he is, but he has no idea who she is, and because of that it leads to quite a few problems. Apart from that main plot though, Eliza also struggles with anxiety, and that's something that she's been dealing with for a long time and something that she deals with a lot in this book. And the main reason why I love this book so much is because of its representation of anxiety. As someone who also has anxiety and who very rarely gets to see that represented so accurately in any sort of media, this was just one of the greatest things for me to read ever. To me, this story reads a lot like Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, and Kath in Fangirl also has anxiety, which is something she deals with, but it's done differently in this book than it is in Fangirl. In Fangirl, Kath's anxiety doesn't play as much of a central role as it does in this one, and I think that's why I was able to relate to this one so much more and why I fell so in love with it. It just felt so real and raw and honest, and it truly made me see myself in literature, which is something that is so rare, and it's just such a fantastic feeling and something I want everyone to be able to experience in every capacity. And yeah, that's why this book is so special and important to me, and I want more people to read it, because if there are other people who are like me who also deal with anxiety, I think that this is the perfect book to kind of give you that feeling of understanding and comfort that you may not be feeling from just talking to someone who doesn't really get it. And so because of that, I would highly, highly recommend picking this one up, even if you don't have anxiety. It's just a fantastic book nonetheless, and something I think anyone could learn something from. The next book on my list is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This is one of those books that I read at the exact right time in my life, and because of that, it like changed my life, and I have never been the same since reading this book, because it's one of those books, again, that made me feel extremely understood. This book follows the story of this boy named Charlie who is trying to navigate his freshman year of high school, and it's told entirely in letters that Charlie is writing to someone who is just addressed as friend. So because of that format, I think some people don't really like this book as much, or they find it more difficult to connect with, but personally, as someone who like journals and who understands what it's like to write a letter to someone who may not necessarily exist or may not be there anymore, I could completely relate to the format of the book, which is one of the reasons I think I connected with it so much. I don't really like to say too much about the plot in general, because I think it's the type of book that you should just kind of go into and experience for yourself. I also recommend watching the movie, because it's one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's a fantastic adaptation. It's just so good, and I love them both. But like I said, I read this book during my freshman year of high school as well, which is why it was the perfect time for me to read it, and why it was so impactful for me. It's just about this boy trying to find out where he fits in, trying to find friends, trying to figure out who he is, while he's also struggling with a lot of deeper, darker things underneath. But I will give some trigger warnings in this book for abuse and attempted suicide, and I don't really remember every other specific thing, so just be aware of that before you go into it. But apart from that, if you have yet to read this book, if you've yet to watch the film, I highly recommend doing both. I adore it so much. And like I said, since this was one of those books that I read at like the right time in my life, and a couple of the other ones on this list are as well, I've always wanted to make a video about that. So if you guys want to see a video about books that changed my life, or books that shaped me, or something like that, then definitely let me know, because I can absolutely make that, because I have quite a few of them. But yeah, nonetheless, highly recommend Perks of Being a Wallflower. Highly recommend you also listen to the soundtrack for the movie while you read this book, because it's excellent. The next book I have here is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicole Yoon. This book follows the story of two different characters, Natasha, who is a Jamaican immigrant whose family is about to be deported, and Daniel, who is a Korean American boy who's just trying to live up to his parents' expectations. And one day, the two of them, Natasha and Daniel, end up bumping into each other and meeting, and this story takes place over that one day as the two of them explore New York City together and get to know each other, and it's kind of like insta-love, but it's essentially the only insta-love I've ever liked. The story deals with a lot more than just the relationship between these two characters. Like I mentioned, Natasha's family is about to be deported, and she's trying to do everything in her power to prevent that from happening. And so the book discusses a lot of very deep and heavy relevant topics. You have discussions of race, immigration, identity, class, just so many important things that I absolutely love finding in YA contemporaries. And all of that is just tied into a simply beautiful, beautiful story. So yeah, that's why this is one of my favorite standalones. And if you want to hear more of my detailed thoughts on it without spoilers as well, I have a full book review for this one too, so I will leave it linked on the screen as well as down below, so you can go and check it out if you're interested. The next book I have on my list is one of those books that is technically getting a sequel, but at the time that it was written and the time that I read it, I didn't know about that, and it wasn't supposed to be getting any sequels, so it was a standalone, which is why it's on this list. It still counts. And that book is none other than Vicious by V.E. Schwab. So now we are into my top 5 favorites, and this is my number 5 favorite standalone of all time. I've talked about this book so many times because Victoria Schwab is essentially my favorite author, and I love everything she has written, but this was the very first book I ever read by her. If you don't know about this book, it follows the story of these two grad students named Eli and Victor who are working on their graduate thesis, and they're trying to prove the existence of EOs, or extraordinary people, essentially people who have superhuman abilities. And in order to do so, they end up experimenting and do figure out a way to create EOs, which leads to a lot of problems. The story's told in 2 timelines, one while they are grad students and one 10 years later, when Victor is just getting out of prison, and you don't really know why. But it is a fantastic book, and I love it so much. If you like X-Men, you will love this book because it is essentially the story of Magneto and Xavier. That's what it feels like. It's not like copying it, it's very different, but it's also very similar. and I just get so many X-Men vibes from this book and I love it. But it's a story that really explores morality and the line between good and evil, which is something I feel like a lot of Victoria Schwab's books do, but I love that theme, so I really love reading books like that, and this one does so I think more than any of the others. And like I said, we are now getting a sequel which is going to be called Vengeful, I believe, and apparently that one's going to be told from Eli's perspective, so it's going to be very different from this one, and I'm so excited for it. But nonetheless, even though this is a video on standalones and now this isn't going to be a standalone anymore, it was a standalone when I read it, so I'm still considering it a standalone, and I will never pass up a time to recommend this book to anyone, so I'm recommending it to you now. Go and read it. The next book that I have on my list is The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslie Walton. This is the very first book that I ever did a book review for on BookTube. I think it was like my second video, and it's also one of the first books I read because of BookTube, and I'm so happy that I did because to this day, almost 2.5 years later, it's still one of my favorite books I have ever read. This book follows the story of this girl named Ava Lavender who was inexplicably born with wings. No one really knows how that happened, there's no explanation for it, but it's just kind of accepted by people even though people think that she's kind of weird. But this is also a generational story, so we get Ava Lavender's story, her mother's story, her grandmother's story, and her great-grandmother's story. And it's essentially about the Lavender family and their relationships with one another, but mostly their relationships with love. That's all I really like to say about it because there is so much more to this book, but it's definitely the type of thing that you should just go into and explore for yourself because it's such a beautiful, beautiful book with so many incredible messages and so many scenes that I just think about to this day. Plus the writing is just so whimsical and exquisite, and I absolutely adore everything about this book. I will give a trigger warning for rape and abuse in this book, so be aware of that before going into it, but if you're okay with reading it, then I highly recommend picking this one up because I don't think that it gets enough attention. It's so underhyped in my opinion, and it deserves more love, and I just love it so much, so I want everyone else to love it too. The next book on my list, I'm sure basically everyone guessed would be here, and that of course is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alire-Sanz. I mentioned the inexplicable logic of my life earlier on this list because that is of course also one of my favorite standalones, but this is my favorite book that he has ever written. This is also in like my top 10 favorite books of all time for sure, so of course it has to be number 3 here. I've talked about this book so many times now that I'd be amazed if someone didn't know what the synopsis was at this point if you've been watching my channel, but if you are new here and if you've never heard me talk about this book, first of all, read it. Second of all, it's about this boy named Aristotle who lives in the 80s in El Paso, Texas, and he's 15 years old, he's in high school, and he doesn't have many friends until one day he ends up meeting this boy named Dante. Yes, they both have names of philosophers. Yes, they do both find it funny. No, it's not for any particular reason. But the two of them quickly become friends, and then their relationship begins to develop from there, and it's an exploration of love, of sexuality, of family, of identity, and just so many things in the most beautiful ways possible, and I just adore this book so much. I feel like I've talked about it so many times that there's nothing more that I can really say to try and convince you to read it if you haven't read it yet, but it's one of my favorite YA contemporaries, one of my favorite books like I mentioned, and I just want so many more people to read it. Lin-Manuel Miranda narrates the audiobook for this book, so if you want to listen to the audiobook instead of reading the physical book, then I highly recommend you go and listen to that audiobook because it's fantastic. But this story just has so much depth and so much meaning, and it has meant so much to me in a very personal way as well, and I just love it. I love everything about it, and I want everyone in the world to read this book. The next book I have on my list is one that I did not expect to have on this list at all, one that took me completely by surprise, a book that I wasn't even planning on reading, and that is Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. By the time this video goes up, I don't know if my review for this book will be up or not, but if it is, I will leave it linked on the screen as well as down below so you can go and check it out. But like I mentioned, Turtles All the Way Down is a book that I was not planning on reading at all. If you know about my relationship with John Green books, I read The Fault in Our Stars when it came out, and I really enjoyed it back then, but I was also like 12 or 13, and I hadn't read too many books, so then I ended up loving a lot of other books more, and then I tried to read some other John Green books like Paper Towns later on, and I just couldn't really get through them, so I didn't really care too much about his books. I always liked him as a person because I love his channel and I think he's super cool, but I just wasn't super into his books. So when I heard about Turtles All the Way Down coming out, I really didn't know much about it, and I didn't really think that I was gonna read it because I didn't care about his other books too much. But then I read this book and everything changed. You know how I mentioned that when I read Perks of Being a Wallflower, I read it at the exact right time in my life? This is another one of those books. Like literally the exact right moment in time that I needed to read this book was when I picked it up and read it, and it changed so much for me. I have never in my life felt more understood by a book than I did while reading Turtles All the Way Down. I don't know how to describe that. It was like I was reading the inside of my own head, and I cried from the very beginning to the very last page. Like I don't think there was more than like 2 chapters where I didn't cry. I was just constantly in tears because I constantly just felt like someone understood, and that was the greatest feeling ever. If you don't know what this book is about, it follows the story of this girl named Asa Holmes who has OCD and an anxiety disorder. And it's basically about her trying to navigate those things. She ends up reconnecting with a childhood friend named Davis Pickett, whose father is this billionaire who has just gone missing. And there's a $100,000 reward that's been put out to anyone who has any information about the billionaire Pickett. And while that's kind of the plot that the synopsis of this book, like on the back of it and on Goodreads and stuff, likes to give you, the main plot really revolves around Ava trying to navigate and live with her mental illness. Now, I personally don't have OCD, so when I say that I related to this book, it wasn't because I understood what it was like to have OCD, and so because of that, I can't speak to the accuracy of the representation of that, but John Green himself does have OCD and anxiety, which is why he wrote this story. It's an own voices story, and it's about his own experience essentially with it, written into a different character and into a fictional story. But the reason that I could relate to this book so much was because of the way that mental illness is just depicted in this book. It is so incredibly real. And there were so many passages that I read in this book that I just couldn't believe had been put down into words. And it made so much of what I couldn't understand about myself feel like I could understand it. I don't know how to describe that. It was just an eye-opening experience and a heart-wrenching experience to understand that there's someone else out there who truly gets what you're feeling. This book made me feel like someone understands all of the thoughts that I have inside my head that I think are crazy or make me crazy were actually legitimate, as if I'm not alone in having those thoughts. And that's really what this book made me feel. It made me feel like I wasn't alone, and there's nothing better than that feeling. If I talk about it too much more, I definitely will cry. I've read this book twice now. I finished it on the plane and then I immediately reread it again because I loved it so much. If you can see, I've tabbed so many of the pages because I loved so many of the quotes and passages. It's just meant so much to me, and I want so many more people to read this book. I will say it's definitely triggering. This book very much feels like you are in the middle of a panic attack. That's what it felt like to me a lot of the time, and so if you are not at the place where you can read that right now, I definitely wouldn't recommend picking it up at this moment. But even though I was in that place, and I still am a lot, I needed to read it during that time, if that makes sense, and I think because I read it during that time, it had a bigger impact on me. But like I said, I can't keep talking about it too much more because I definitely will cry. All I can say is this book took me completely by surprise, and as you can see, it's number 2 on this list. It is literally one of my favorite books of all time. Probably number 2. You all know what number 1 is, and it's coming up on this list, but this one may overtake that at some point. Don't know. Depends on how many more times I reread it and how much more it means to me, but I love it. I love it with all of my heart. And of course, lastly on my list of all-time favorite standalones, the book that everyone was waiting for because I never shut up about it, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Genuinely, how many more times do I have to mention this book before everyone reads it? I don't know. I feel like I push it in every single video, but if you haven't read it yet, this is your next chance. This is me reminding you to pick it up finally. If you happen to not know, The Night Circus follows the story of this magical circus that is only open at night, and it serves as a venue for these 2 magicians who are in a competition with one another, but they don't really know that they are each other's competition. It's very magical, very whimsical, written in such a beautiful, beautiful way that will evoke every single one of your senses, and I cannot recommend it enough. I feel like every time I talk about it, I say the exact same thing because there's nothing else for me to say. It's just wonderful and perfect, and I want so many people to read it. But truly, if you like anything magical, you will enjoy this book because it's purely magic. It is just simply and purely magic. That's the best way to describe it. Alright guys, so that is it for my list of my all-time favorite standalones. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I have so many favorites. I have so many more books that aren't on this list that I also adore, but I was trying to cut it down because this list was already super long, and I know that there are so many other books that I'm gonna read in my lifetime that'll also make it on this list because there are so many on my TBR that I have been wanting to read for so long that I know are gonna be favorites, but nonetheless, I had to make this video now because at this moment in time, these are my favorites, and I love all of them so much. Let me know in the comments down below if any of the books I mentioned on my list are any of your favorites as well, or definitely let me know what some of your favorite standalones are because I'm always looking for new books to read even though I have a never-ending TBR. If you'd like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!